Tri-City Sports Now. My next guest is the relatively new, he's been at the position for a few weeks, but sports editor of the Bristol Herald-Courier, which I think has the reputation of being the best sports page in the Tri-Cities. But Brian Woodson is not anyone new to the Tri-Cities, in addition to the fact that he previously wrote at the Bristol Herald-Courier about a little more than a decade ago. I remember in my first tenure at this radio station reading his work in the Irwin Record covering the Unicoi County Blue Devils, who I was the play-by-play broadcaster, and searching through the article. Is there anything I missed? Is there anything that I learned that Nick Lingerfelt, who recently has been a football as well as a baseball coach at David Crockett, was actually a Eagle Scout when he was playing linebacker at Unicoi County and holding the kicks for Stav Ravino from Brazil. So the the international flavor of Unicoi County sports is not necessarily anything new. Anyway, another fun story. I want to see if you remember this, Brian. I was talking about this is several years ago. It was 2005 actually. And that was the year that I covered the Wheeling Nailers for the Wheeling Intelligencer in Wheeling, West Virginia. And they play the West Virginia State High School Football Championships. And I remember I'm working a desk, and all this, get a phone call up here. Hi, I'm Brian Woodson from Bluefield. Could you give us some scores of the high school games that are going on in Wheeling? And I'm going, Brian Woodson, did you used to write for the Irwin Record? And he says, yes. Hi, it's Marky Billson. Remember me? I don't know. Do you remember our reconnection? Lo, those many years, I guess 14 now, years ago, and very unexpected when you called up the Wheeling Intelligencer looking for scores for the Daily Telegraph.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that. It's been a while, but yeah, we were always calling various newspapers, especially in Wheeling, during football season to get some help. We were always short on staff, so we needed help, all the help we could get.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult to send a writer up, I'm sure, from Bluefield to Wheeling, unless maybe there's a Bluefield team playing in the state title game. But no, you've been around. I mean, I mentioned Bluefield, but Brian Woodson, I mentioned also Bristol and the Irwin Record. When did you start covering sports in the Tri-Cities? What was your first job around here?
I went back to college and went to East Tennessee State in 2005, and I was looking for an internship, and Tom Harris, who was the editor there at the Irwin Record at the time, I was recommended to go talk to him, and he gave me an opportunity, so I started covering Unicoi County.
Was this 2005 or 1995?
Oh, 1995. I'm sorry, yeah. 1995. Yeah, it's been a while, even longer. And so he gave me an opportunity, and I just stayed with it. And once I graduated, I just ended up staying there until I came to Bristol in 1999.
Well, I know that you went, like I said, to Bristol in 99. I do remember that. And so you would have also learned under, I guess it would have been Jack Mooney in the ETSU journalism department, who I have a lot of respect for. And, once turned me on to, let's say, the great Wally Butts Saturday Evening Post scandal of years gone by. He actually would teach that in his classes. But tell us a little bit now, at Bluefield, I know you're the sports editor there for, more than a decade or so, covering, say, the Appalachian League and certainly the local high schools and all this. But what brought you back to Bristol?
I just been looking to make a change, and Bristol came open, and I was contacted by some people at the staff to see if I was interested, so I just came down here and did an interview and prayed about it, thought about it, and decided to go ahead and make the change.
Well, Brian Woodson, I can tell you, I mean, obviously Bristol is going to be a little more cosmopolitan than Bluefield. I mean, you covered the Winston Cup, you covered the Winston Cup race there for the BHC, and certainly, I mean, you don't have to sacrifice Appalachian League baseball. You've got, but I guess, what is your vision right now for the Bristol Herald-Courier sports section? I've always enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the historical stories. I've always thought that it's done a very nice job in covering NASCAR, and by being in Bristol, it probably has a national readership at bristolnews.com because of that when it comes to NASCAR season. So right now, what would you like to do with the Bristol Herald-Courier sports section?
I'm still getting my feet wet again, learning what's going on, what needs to be covered, and what schools are wishing. So many schools have changed since I was here before. And but but mainly just keep it going. You know, I like the fact that we have so much local coverage, and we seem to have a lot of coaches who are good about calling in results and being helpful to help us get teams covered and get, you know, we want to get as many features done as we can on players and try to do as much as we can on the local colleges too. And you know, we have a good, you know, NASCAR. Alan Gregory does a terrific job with that, so we lean on him a lot for that work. And then we have and Tim Hayes does an excellent job with his history column.
Mm-hmm.
You know, everybody loves those, and they're great. And so things are going good. I don't think there's a whole lot of need to make a lot of changes. Just come in and try to keep it going, and try to keep the local part of the local sport. A local paper should be covering local sports and not focus on national news, in my opinion. So that's what we're trying to do, is do as much local as we can.
I understand that, and I do agree with you as well, because if you don't cover it, who else will? And frankly, although I do think it's important to have somewhere in the paper, you know, Red Sox win the World Series when it happens, or, you know, putting the Masters results and the hockey scores in from today. I do think that's important, so that, you know, you have that to look over and all that. I'm not sure if people are really going to the Bristol Herald-Courier for that to be their first source for national news, but they would go for it for their first source on, let's say, the Virginia High Bearcats or something like that. But you mentioned the changes in schools. Yeah, there's no more Virginia Intermont, that sort of thing. I do want to ask you, though, when you look at the Bristol Herald-Courier and such, and you say, what do you want covered? I know a few years ago, BHC stopped covering ETSU. There was no, beat writer the way that Trey Williams had been in years gone by, and for that matter, I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name, is now a columnist in Houston. They had one who did a big enterprise story on the lack of ETSU having a football program. Brian T. Smith, that was the man's name. But I wanted to ask you, is that a goal by any chances to have more ETSU coverage, or do you think that they are more or less just a, say, Johnson City, Kingsport, that area entity?
I hope we can do more on ETSU. When I took the job, they still cover a little bit of basketball and all the football, but not as much as I probably would prefer. It's something I'm going to be discussing that with the higher ups. So, but hopefully we will be covering more of what ETSU does. We try to do as much as we can. We report on whatever gets sent to us, and we would like to get there and cover more games and do more features. And of course, we want to see more local kids there too. And the ones that are local, we'll try to featurize as much as possible.
Yeah. So
we would like to do more, but that's I got to do whatever my bosses want us to do. So we have to see how that goes.
I understand that, Brian Woodson of the Bristol Herald-Courier. I want to also, though, ask you, when you say local players, are you looking more for, let's say, Sullivan County players, or dare I say Washington County, Virginia players, or would someone like Patrick Good from David Crockett High School in Jonesboro, and I realize that the Bristol Herald-Courier's readership, its primary readership, it's not like the paper has never been seen in Jonesboro, of course, but, it would deal, let's face it, more with, say, Sullivan County, more with Washington County, Virginia, that sort of thing, than Washington County, Tennessee. So let me just say that, would a Patrick Good, just for using an example of a local athlete, but maybe not one that you would think Bristol, would that be somebody that maybe you might do a feature on? Because he is Tri-Cities, if he isn't Bristol per se.
Oh, yeah, definitely. He's a Division I player, a very good player. We have Tim does a wonderful job keeping up with the locals and the colleges, and he always includes kids from that area and how they're doing and where various places they're at. So, yeah, we would definitely include them in there, I'm sure.
Brian Woodson, news sports editor, Bristol Herald-Courier. Why does it seem like the Bristol Herald-Courier has had such a turnover over the years as the sports editor?
I don't know, to be honest. That's good. When I was there as a reporter, from 1999 to 2005, we had three or four of them, and I'm not really sure what to do. I'm not sure what to do unless they just want to go on to greener pastures. I know Nate, who was there before me, he had to do it for family purposes because he has some young children he wants to spend more time with, and when you're working nights all the time, there's not much opportunity to do that. So, but other people, they've just gone on to other opportunities. I'm not really sure. That's a good question.
I want to ask you as a journalist. I mean, well, I can remember also, and this goes hand in hand. One of those sports editors, I believe, was Michael White, who became the sports information director at ETSU. And I always thought that was a little bit curious, but also I thought it was like so Tri-Cities, because Brian Woodson, I don't know if you've listened to the show or you sort of know my background or my belief, but often one of my main criticisms of the area's sports coverage is it sometimes seems as if the reporters see themselves more as an extension of the public relations department of whatever entity they cover, be it high school, college, BMS, whatever it is, than really being the true journalist and such. And that would go hand in hand with a former sports editor becoming a publicist, a SID at ETSU. I just, in your backgrounds, I mean, have you noticed that in the Tri-Cities? Would you agree with me that there does seem to be a little bit more tending to be PR in the sports coverage and not enough journalism?
I have to think about that answer a little bit. I don't know. I'd have to think about that answer. I'm not really sure what to tell you on that. You do want to go out there and be a journalist. You also want to, quote, stay on the good side of your, if you can, or you want to make sure you keep your sources at all these different schools where you can use them and feel free to use them. But you also want to feel like Alan does a great job.
Mm-hmm.
He's very critical sometimes in his articles about NASCAR and how things are done, but he also works very closely with the PR people at Bristol Motor Speedway. So there is an interchange. You can do both, in most cases that I've been around, if you do have to feel critical or maybe change a little bit of how you go about reporting to the people you're working with, they might get upset, but they understand it's part of your job, and in most cases it doesn't cause any problem. You just go on and go on with life, and just continue your coverage as you do as you go over time.
I would only say that I feel one good rule of thumb in that is that if you don't make it personal, if you criticize the performance and not make it personal, then that'll go a long way. And that's always been something that I've tried to go. It may make the show less edgy. I don't know. But I've felt that that's one of the lessons that they learn. If you don't make it personal, if the coach is a poor strategist or if he made a mistake, but he's not a bum, that makes a big difference, I think, because that does open up. And I think most coaches, not all, and some around here, and I've got my own philosophies here. I've often said that the smaller the town, the bigger the ego sometimes the high school coach has, because, when I covered high school sports in Pittsburgh, the high school coaches there were happy that they got some stuff in the sports page. They were, it was all going to be about the Steelers or the Panthers. They knew they were third string. You go to, Smallville, Tennessee, the high school coach, he is the big coach in town, and sometimes he feels that he can throw his weight around that way. I've always felt that. I don't know, and it's just an opinion I want to throw out there. If you wish to comment, great. But no, that's one of the things when you look at trying to cover from a journalistic perspective and such. I want to ask you here, I'm going to take a break on my, and hold off the commercial for just a bit as it comes up here, and I have to make my button right here, you see, Brian Woodson. Forgive me if that sounds a little unprofessional, but one of the things I do like to talk about here, Brian Woodson, is making the area a bit more cosmopolitan, and I've always felt that the best way to do that is through sports. I mentioned this, I don't know if you had the chance to hear the previous segment, but 30 years ago, Brian Woodson, as terms of TV markets, the Tri-Cities was the 92nd in the country. Las Vegas was the 90th. I remember reading that and thinking, wow, we're top 100 out of 210, and, we're right there with Vegas. Well, right now, Vegas is 39, and we're 102. And you see what Vegas has done in the sports world, and certainly their former mayor, Oscar Goodman, did everything he could to make Vegas more of a sporting palace. And my question that I'm going to ask you, Brian Woodson, is, are there things you think that this area can be on a sports level that are more cosmopolitan. And I can give you some examples if you'd like to know. But do you think that this area could be more cosmopolitan when it comes to sports?
I mean, pretty much, I think the area has been for years with NASCAR, of course. And then,
but that's falling. That's the point.
Yeah, it has fallen, I always said. But, I know this area loves their sports, and they're building out here in Abingdon. They're building a complex to bring in more ball game, more teams. I know that's not national and stuff, but I think there is room for that. Right now the area is, since I've just been back here a couple months, I'm still trying to learn my way around. But it seems like the area is growing like crazy.
Well, the TV market doesn't really say that. It's fallen, actually. Yeah. Now, I know that I think that when I several years ago, it was like 455,000 people in the market, and it's now 473. But I mean, no, the world is bigger, I mean, it's got 7.5 billion people in it now. I can remember when, what was it, 6 billion or so, So the world gets bigger, but the area's growth has not been what some other areas perhaps has been. We're not Gary, Indiana, thank goodness, or Newport News, but also not Las Vegas, obviously. And that's where I sort of say, look, I mean, the area has low taxes. The area has wide open spaces. You could, literally double the population and still have, wouldn't be overcrowded. But yet it's fallen. And I've sometimes felt like, look, I'll throw this by you. Would it be better if we had a AA baseball team rather than, say, the old Appalachian League, which has that high school feel of not the area coming together, but rather Bristol playing Kingsport or Johnson City playing Elizabethton, old high school rivalries and a mentality there, something along those lines. Or, as I've suggested, a new arena in the area. ETSU is playing at a nearly 50-year-old park. And what would it mean if you could get a new venue that could bring in minor league sports, say hockey? What would it mean for the area to have an ECHL team where Knoxville, Roanoke, and Asheville wouldn't? So it's these sort of things that I talk about a little bit and trying to see if we can be more... I just like your opinion if you think that those are good ideas, Brian Woodson.
Oh, yeah, I don't see any problem with trying to bring in something like that. You have to make sure you have the market for it. And that has to do some studies to figure that out. I would like to see a higher level of baseball. I love the Appalachian League, I always have, but it doesn't really bring national attention. I mean, people don't barely know the Appalachian League exists, unfortunately, other than if it's not in our part of the country. But it would be cool to, if they build a new state like they're talking about in Bristol, maybe they could attempt to bring in the bigger level club, but of course, they've been with the Appalachian League so long, I don't know if that would ever change. But it would be nice to see it change, something like that, or like you said, a hockey team. I don't know how that would do in this area, but I like the fact that ETSU built. I went over and saw their new football stadium last week. It's beautiful. They could maybe try to do something like that and bring in some activity there. So.
All I'm saying with the ECHL is that, or a hockey team of that area. I mean, why would it not work here if it has, there have been minor league hockey in Knoxville since 1961 on and off. I mean, the Ice Vols are the first college hockey team in the South. I mean, you think about why wouldn't it work here when you look at the demographics of the population? And for that matter, something, if you remember the movie Slapshot, what do those transplants want? A Saturday night game, and all that. So, Reggie Dunlap can con Dickie Dunn or something for that. But no, that's what I'm talking about here, And such an arena also, I mean, if ETSU were playing basketball, and it would certainly advance the program greatly, instead of playing in an old arena with nothing around it, theoretically an arena that either would have something to do before or after currently or something you could build around. I mean, that's what I talk about in terms of being more cosmopolitan, Brian Woodson. That's one of the reasons I wanted you on, so I could throw that out there on a public basis and such. You mentioned a new ballpark in Bristol, and I guess that is one of my concerns, is that you'll have individual municipalities paying all kinds of money, Elizabethton putting in $1.5 million, taking away from other athletic fields, and for that matter, their police lease so that you could have bigger umpire rooms at Joe O'Brien Field and ultimately save the Twins franchise. But would it be better off if instead of, oh, look, Elizabethton gets their name on the back of the baseball card and still nobody knows where they are, if you did have a Tri-Cities and, oh, that's that place in Tennessee on the back of the baseball card instead for, say, people going up to, I don't know, expansion Nashville team, the Reds, whatever, that sort of thing. That's what I'm talking about right there. So anyhow, just looking forward here. What else can you expect at the Bristol Herald-Courier? What you mentioned you're trying to get your feet wet, but are there any visions that you have right now for the sports section?
Not right now. I mean, like I said, I'm just trying to get myself back into acclimated to what we're doing and what the paper wants and what the community wants, what my bosses want, and then I feel like we'll see how it goes. And we don't have a whole lot of personnel. There's only three of us, well, four of us counting me, and so we don't have a whole lot of weeks. We don't have a big staff like we used to. We just have to pick and choose and do what we can, and we'll see how it goes. I don't really have any ideas right now in my head, but I will as I get closer. Probably closer to football season. That's when it really picks up. Right now it's spring sports. We like spring sports, but they don't have the interest, unfortunately, that the football does. So, I hope I'll have a few more ideas. By that time, I should be in pretty good shape knowing what we need to do and what we can't do.
Could I ask you, I know I can't remember the gentleman's name, but I remember once talking to somebody at the Bristol Herald-Courier who was an editor in the past, and they're talking about the sports section, and this is several years ago. He said, game stories, that's a thing of the past. Not that we don't have them, but you don't want to be that being the major part of your sports section, because basically when the paper comes out, everybody knows who's won already. If you're going to do a game story, you got to have some detail, something that you saw that the average person didn't, that sort of thing. And so there was more things about, say, columns, features, enterprise, that sort of thing. Do you think you'll be trying to head in that direction as the sports editor?
Yeah, we definitely want to do a lot of. I love features. I think people like reading things. You still got to have the day-to-day coverage.
Oh, sure, you need it for historical purposes.
But I do like the features, like feature, enterprise, columns, things like we did a lot of that last week with the NASCAR. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of thing you want to do. You want to have something different from what they can get from another media outlet or another newspaper.
What's your idea to get the fans back at Bristol?
That's a good question. I think I thought all along they were getting too big too fast, and they just started adding more to the seats here in Bristol. They've done it all over NASCAR, adding more seats. I think people are going to keep coming, but after a while, everything gets stale when they move on to something else, and that's happened. I think with NASCAR, you've lost some personalities either to death or to retirement, and I just think. And plus, nothing's getting cheaper now, and it's getting more and more pricey to be able to afford to come to a race. And then the weather doesn't help any, because the weather's always been, especially the spring race, has been affected for years.
No, the thing is, the rain was. Yeah.
I'm not sure what I've never been a big NASCAR fan, but I'm trying to get back into it here. And I thought the actual racing itself was pretty good. I think what they want to see is more wrecks, and these drivers are so good now that they want. And the track has been changed, which I've heard 100 million times. So there isn't quite as much contact when they're going around the turns, and the fans seem to love that kind of stuff. They love the big accident, and the drivers, they're not out there trying to wreck. They're out there trying to get around the track 500 times and win. So it's kind of you got to keep the fans happy, but you got these great drivers out there like Kurt Busch and Kyle Busch who don't seem to get in a lot of trouble. When they do, they get out of it and make up for it. So,
Brian,
they've got a lot of questions to answer, a lot of questions to figure out.
Well, Brian, some interesting thoughts right there on, building it too big. I've thought about that myself, that they didn't see that, maybe we want to consider what the sellout mentality will be and all that in the future and such. I do get what you're saying right there. And certainly, I think that was the problem with the mini dome. for many years is that it was just, it's, you can have 12,000 for football if everything goes well. Yes, but how many times did that actually happen? How many? So those are the things I've wondered this week if BMS isn't the new mini dome. Anyway, he's Brian Woodson. He is the sports editor of the Bristol Herald-Courier. Welcome back to town after about a decade or so up in Bluefield and covering everything from the Blue Jays to Bluefield College and certainly the high schools there. So yes, for him, it is a bit of a bigger market here at the BHC. And I would say this, you've got a 4-man staff on your sports section. Yeah, that is small, I guess. It's the same as John City Press has. But remember this, in Yuma, Arizona, they only got 2 at the Yuma Sun. So be thankful. Sometimes you got to say, well, this is the modern era of newspapers and such. And so anyhow, push for more, but be thankful for what you have. Brian Woodson, Bristol Herald-Courier. I hope I didn't sound like I was preaching too much to you, and I probably did.
I hope I did okay.
No, that's fine here.